Hey everybody, it's Tom, and I'm going to come to you today with the follow-up from, or the second of the three videos, at least initially three, which I'm planning to do, on Simone de Beauvoir's Ethics of Ambiguity. Last time we talked about how she presents ambiguity as an ineluctable, an inevitable component of human existence. And the manner in which oftentimes efforts at moving towards some sort of moral discernment are compromised by a suppression of that ambiguity. But if we are to take freedom seriously as the point of departure for ethical or moral reality, we really have to resist the temptation to affect such a suppression or an evasion and sort of take an ersatz or false refuge in an illusion of certitude. And in the second section, which is entitled Personal Freedom and Others, we have a pivot away from sort of establishing that ambiguity is the point of departure along all sorts of different axes, trajectories, vectors. Um, but how does it come about that for very many uh, there is an alienation? Well, that's probably not the best word. There is an effort to escape from the implications of that ambiguity, and she offers some prospects in this second section, beginning with an interesting analysis of certain features of human development. What does it mean? What is it that constitutes the basis of our unhappiness at times? And she actually opens with an analysis of the situation of the child, of the situation which we, all have encountered at, a point or several points in our existence, if you like, where we are cast into a world which is seemingly ready made. It is a world in which we were not involved as creators, responders, and it is a world populated by seemingly godlike entities, namely our parents, adults, and so forth. And against this backdrop, there is at times an impression of our own insignificance, which paradoxically, for the child, can be liberating because they can then proceed to formulate their own little projects, plans, play with abandon, escaping, as it were, the anguish of freedom because they don't see themselves as having a real stake in the world. Now, interestingly, as they undertake these processes of play, an incredible seriousness can be assumed. Now, at this junction or in the course of the conversation, the theme of seriousness, which I believe we mentioned very briefly before, is given a more explicit articulation. And to be serious is to accept the values of the world as ready made and established certifiably, right? Beyond doubt or compunction. And this presumption actually can create very problematic rigidity. That doesn't seem that problematic when you see it exhibited in the child, who will assume a role with great earnestness, but with an awareness nonetheless that there is an ability to step outside of that role. Now, in the background of that tension, there's this kind of promissory note that one day I, as a child, am going to grow up, and it's not just going to be, you know, me playing the Pirate King. I will be the Pirate King. and what have you, right? And we have the luxury, the metaphysical privilege, is a phrase which Simone de Beauvoir invokes as children to really enjoy these fantasies because we are protected by this world of the omnipotent adults around us. Now, obviously, this is an illusion which comes to grief for most of us, but not all, in the course of our adolescence. When the godlike quality of our parents and the contingency of the world and the reality of ambiguity begins to impose itself upon us, and a series of disillusionments make untenable the fantasies of our youth. And it is at this junction that we really enter into our own as human beings, as it is at this junction that the moment and the actual challenge of our freedom presents itself. Our freedom is something which has stake and consequence both for ourselves and quite significantly for others. No longer are we playing a game as we were when we were children. Now things are live, things are real. It's go time. And it can produce a crisis of variable length because with the apprehension of that freedom, we also have the apprehension of the challenges of ambiguity. Who are we going to be? And because the decisions we make in that moment inevitably will bring us into contest, either with the world or with other people, there's going to often be a kind of hesitance that presents itself. It's a space of indeterminacy, and obviously various courses can be taken from that space, some of which are problematic precisely because they suppress that ambiguity. One way in which this can occur is that some sort of just fall into a rather lamentable conformity with the pressure of the moment, whatever the current of the day is, whatever one's, immediate peer group has to say, etc., etc., etc. This is a decision basically not to make the decision. And if it was to be summed in a word, that word would likely be mediocrity. Unfortunately, it's a reality that can infect our life. In fact, de Beauvoir is very derisory in her treatment of this sort of trajectory, calling it really a kind of subhuman, right, way of living. Not making a commitment is really to forfeit one's participation, or pretend or attempt to forfeit one's participation, one's capacity as a human being, as a potential. Now, that's one way of going about it, and I'm gonna offer my note of mild optimism, in that, or perhaps more than mild optimism, in that I think that very few people actually fall into this category. They can be encountered. And perhaps all of us have regions of our life where this occurs to a degree. But I think more often what happens is that while maybe we are evasive, we're often evasive in more courageous ways, or maybe we're just stumbling or dealing with a difficult set of limitations. So I think it is of some moment to recall that, lest the contemplation of the mediocre inspire a kind of cynicism and abandonment, which I feel is both counterproductive and predicated on an inadequate picture of reality more broadly. But to move beyond this category of the mediocre, there's then, the other problem. That's the problem of the serious man, which building up from the notion that the serious is that which takes things as ready made, as certain, as beyond reproach or doubt. Uh, this is a scenario where a person subtly evades the ambiguity of their own freedom by committing themselves entirely to a singular object. And ironically, the object which they choose, the ideology, the goal, the purpose, the end, is almost a matter of indifference. Whether it's as a communist, a capitalist, a Christian, a secularist, what have you, or something maybe even more banal. What's happening is that you're displacing the choice by creating a framework which, in a sense, makes one's decisions for oneself. And a great deal of power can be generated through this strategy. It's hardly a harmless affair, but it's ultimately a renunciation of freedom. And I think most of us have at one point or another encountered an individual who is sectarian or fanatical in their ideological commitment. And one thing that strikes, or that has struck me in interfacing with such people, is an incredible rigidity. And that rigidity sort of betokens how it's an incredibly claustrophobic manner in which to lead one's life. And it's a dishonest claustrophobia because on one level or another, no matter how energized one might be about what one has become utterly serious, and here we're using the word serious in this sort of more narrow sense, there is awareness on one level or another that you can depart from that seriousness, that you can acknowledge that an absolute confidence is not altogether warranted. And at times, when people allow themselves to be recalled to that fact, a new crisis can be provoked. A crisis which can have potentially positive or negative outcomes. Because on one hand, it can devolve on the negative side into various species of nihilism, where no longer satisfied, knowing that one cannot simply give oneself over to a very certain way of seeing the world, you then decide to enter into an attitude of utter negation and destruction. But this itself is internally incoherent and unstable because the very effort to negate reality itself is an exhibition, an exertion of presence and of positivity. Tragically distorted, but which belies the ultimate intent of the nihilist trajectory, which is again to escape accepting the indeterminacy of the world and the hazard or risk which accompanies all freedom. And nihilism can take on sometimes subtle disguises. So it's not always, an obvious kind of thing. And then there are other strategies, like the strategies of adventurism, for example, which are actually partially nihilistic, in that the adventurer may be able to sort of detach himself from an attachment, from a particular outcome or an end, and give himself over, to the quest, to the conquest, to the expedition. But there's a sort of myopia and almost a pretended solipsism in that what you've done is you've shifted the object, the thing, which is the basis of a rigidity, which is at odds with one's own freedom, with the means to that end. And in either case, whether the certitude and the commitment is placed unequivocally in the end or objective, or in the process whereby one pursues the objective, that insertion creates a distortion that translates into violence and tyranny, because there's an act of subjugation before the chosen means or ends. The act of subjugation will necessarily involve an imposition of oneself on others. And so, that's just one example. She also talks about the tyrant in conjunction with the notion of the adventurer, and also talks about, by contrast to the attitude of the serious, there's also the attitude of the passionate. And, similarly, you can have a positive or negative outcome here. Because the passionate individual, what she means by passion is someone who will consume themselves in adoration as opposed to pursuit of an object and or person. Paradoxically, this will translate into a kind of drive toward possession of this object singularly. Whereas in the former case, the case of the serious person, which devolves into a kind of nihilism, possession is almost secondary to the dynamic. You would think that it would have a greater role to play there, but it's more just like a driving assertion of one's self through the object, as opposed to a subsumption of the object. Now, and she goes into it in some level of detail in the text, but I go ahead and just try and gloss it by saying that what's positive is that in order for the passion to be redeemed, it must ultimately let the object go, whether that be a person, in which case the letting of the object go is a rather obvious thing, or even if it is an object or something like art or philosophy or something to that effect, the passion can be redeemed if one suddenly understands that the value of what is loved or felt ultimately derives from the manner in which it can be shared by all people. And so the sacrifice of oneself, which can sometimes be willingly offered as a consequence of passion, is a sacrifice made not for one's own possession of the object, but for one's ability to make that object available to others. And when this transposition occurs, there's a movement toward the possibility of genuine freedom. Because genuine freedom is no longer bound by any single object, plan, person, destination, what have you. It is indeterminate, and that indeterminacy is actually what enables it to reach out in a positive way toward reality itself. And it is also a predicate bond amongst all people, amongst all, if you like to use a phrase that's common in Buddhist circles, sentient beings, right? All, she talks about the bond of all men, of all humanity. And I only hesitate there because I don't want to delimit the sphere of freedom to just the human sphere. But I think the gist comes across. Now, in the course of her analysis, which hopefully my précis, my recap of it hasn't been too desiccant, too arid, there are a few remarkable signs, but I just wanted to read this one line, which I think really sums it up very well, and that is simply that love, ultimately, is a renunciation of all possession and of all confusion. Now, what I'm going to focus on here is not the possession part of the equation, which I think is pretty clear, but the confusion part. What's going on there? The call of love, which ultimately is, in my view, also the call of freedom, demands positive lucidity, because it is only in the space of such lucidity that we can authentically appreciate the other for what they are, as a person distinct from ourselves. Otherwise, if we fool ourselves about what's going on there, then we end up flying into one of these sort of problematic trajectories of seriousness or pathological passion or ideology or, all the rest of it, right? So, in a way, what she's done in the second section is two main things. On the foundation of the first section, which establishes the ground of ambiguity, she then points to a sort of taxonomy or a grouping of ways in which we can avoid taking that ambiguity seriously. And then, through the course of that taxonomy, then turns to illustrate how, when you really look closely at the matter, freedom cannot be bound, and that need to be boundless connects it to love and to a serious interrogation and engagement of our relationship with other people. Serious here in a different sense of the word. We've used at other points in our discussion here today, in the sense that we have to take them as other and as also free. And now, because freedom has to manifest itself in concrete particular projects in specific situations, we are then placed in the domain of what she describes as the antinomies of action, where because we're taking other people as also free, there's inevitably tension and conflict. And how do we navigate that tension and conflict in a way which allows that freedom to prosper and that love to prosper? And that's sort of really, where the question of the ethical, where the rubber hits the road. So, the final section of the book is then an examination of these so-called antinomies of action. And that's what we'll go into in the next video. So hopefully thank you guys for listening. And once again, this has been Tom talking about Simone de Beauvoir, Ethics of Ambiguity. I'll catch you guys on the flip. Bye.